Welcome back into Lesson 3, which is strictly about non-performing notes and foreclosure. Let's start by really understanding the foreclosure process, because this is where things get a little bit nuanced. And if you're buying or plan to buy non-performing loans or NPLs, this single lesson will equip you with the knowledge that typically takes investors years to learn. In 2010, I began learning a great deal about the foreclosure process and how it differs across the U.S. from state to state. I was working on a portfolio of roughly 1,200 NPLs, and it was critical for me to understand the status of every foreclosure in that portfolio that we had just purchased. This consisted of personally calling dozens of foreclosure firms across the country and talking to attorneys about the cases. And I can't tell you how valuable this activity was in terms of understanding the nuances of the foreclosure process. And I discovered a lot of reasons why foreclosures get put on hold or even canceled. I discovered which types of files have a higher probability of the borrower filing bankruptcy at the last minute. And I learned effective bidding strategies as a lender taking a loan to foreclosure sale. Now, this is key to optimizing the proceeds when a third party buys the property at auction. With that being said, let's talk about the differences between judicial and non-judicial foreclosures. A foreclosure is the action of taking possession of a mortgage property when the borrower fails to keep up on their mortgage payments. And a judicial foreclosure involves actually filing a lawsuit. Now, this is done in civil court to obtain a judgment against the borrower. And this includes the right to foreclose against the property and force its sale. A judicial foreclosure is typically more expensive than a non-judicial foreclosure, and is typically more time-consuming as well. A judicial foreclosure may also provide what's called a right of redemption after the property is sold at auction. This allows the borrower to repay the lender after the foreclosure sale within a certain time frame. And that time frame varies from state to state, but is typically 6 months or less. This allows the borrower to reacquire title to the property. Now let's cover some basics on non-judicial foreclosures. A non-judicial foreclosure involves what's called a notice of default, or an NOD. The NOD is sent to the borrower by the lender's foreclosure attorney. And this notice indicates the borrower is in default on their loan and outlines the time in which they have to cure the default. If the borrower fails to cure the default, the property is noticed for sale. The successful bidder at the foreclosure sale will now own the property. And that successful bidder could be a third-party investor, or it could be the lender. And at this time, title is also conveyed from the trustee to the new owner through a document called a trustee's deed. And if there are no bidders at the trustee sale, the property simply reverts or comes back to the lender. And the property is then considered real estate owned, or REO. Now, the country is somewhat divided, with most judicial states in the east and most non-judicial states in the west. And there's also a fair number of states where both types of foreclosure can be conducted, judicial and non-judicial. And just like all exit strategies, there are pros and cons to foreclosing. In some cases, the best outcome is to modify the loan and get the borrower back on track, which we'll cover in another lesson. But there are other times when the foreclosure is actually the best option for both the lender and the borrower. When a borrower can no longer afford the obligation of the mortgage and the taxes and the insurance and the maintenance of the home, there's something to be said about getting out from under that burden. And this can be an opportunity for the borrower to start fresh elsewhere. However, that's easier said than done. Some borrowers don't always see it that way, and sometimes the foreclosure is the only option for the lender because the borrower can't or simply won't pay. And it's important to be aware of the stall tactics used by borrowers to delay or stop the foreclosure. Now, as concerns over predatory lending practices grew over the past decade, the courts began to really sympathize with borrowers, and there was a rise in what's called foreclosure defenses, which challenged the foreclosure. Now, contested foreclosures can be extremely costly to the lender, and you should really approach those with caution. I actually had a client that spent over $200,000 on legal bills just fighting a single borrower. It took him 4 years in Florida. Now, there are a lot of reasons a borrower can contest a foreclosure. Disputing a payment history is one of them. This basically consists of the borrower questioning the proper application of their payments. Another borrower dispute has to do with compliance. When a loan is sold, the borrower must be notified of the change in ownership. And this is accomplished through what's called a Truth in Lending Act letter, or a TILA. Now, a defense used by some borrowers is to suggest they weren't properly notified with this letter. And there are also ways a borrower can suggest flaws in the foreclosure summons. A borrower or their attorney might argue that the note was lost and that the lender doesn't have standing. Standing refers to having sufficient stake in the outcome, in this case to foreclose. A temporary restraining order, or TRO, is another way to contest a foreclosure. And this is a process undertaken by a borrower through a judge which stops the lender from foreclosing. It can often be followed by the borrower actually suing the lender. Now, a qualified written request, or QWR, is when a borrower requests correspondence from the mortgage servicer. The correspondence generally asserts that the servicer made an error, oftentimes with respect to applying the mortgage payments. Now, bankruptcy is yet another way to block foreclosure. So we've covered a lot of information in this lesson. Let's recap. The foreclosure process is complex and nuanced. Judicial foreclosures can be costly and time-consuming, especially compared to non-judicial foreclosures. And lenders should be familiar with a host of foreclosure defenses and look for ways to limit lender liability. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.